And I want to talk about the Speaker of the House race. So this is ongoing. It's going to continue. It's not about to end. Republicans can't do anything right. They always lose. They're a failure. It's obnoxious and infuriating. Yada, yada, yada. Same old, day in and day out with Republicans. 22 Republicans refused again to vote for Jim Jordan, 2 more than in the first round of voting. And I want to talk about exactly why this is. And I want to start the clock here for 5 minutes. I am going to tell you the nuanced philosophical underpinning of what the heck is wrong with these Republicans. Like, do these 22 Republicans actually want Hakeem Jeffries to be Speaker of the House? Do they actually want a conservative to be Speaker of the House? If not, why are they in the Republican Party? Well, the answer to this is not just, oh, they're sold to K Street. They need the lobbyists' money. They are part of the military-industrial complex. That's all true. It's part of it. They're in the Appropriations Committee. Also true. All those things are accurate observations. But the reason that these Republican politicians are so vulnerable to that kind of corruption, the reason that they are loyal first, not to their constituents, but to the lobbyists and to the military-industrial complex that profits them, to the Appropriations Committee that profits them, is because they are suffering from a serious philosophical illness. And let me explain to you what it is. The Republican Party, we can start the clock because it is going to be 5 minutes from right now. The Republican Party has fallen for the false idea of neutrality. They think that neutrality can exist in the public space. They think that there can be an even playing field and government can refuse to enforce or withhold enforcing any kind of morality, that each individual person can bring their own version of right and wrong, moral and immoral to the public square, and we can all coexist. This is not true. This is a false idea. There's no such thing as neutrality, whether you're talking government institutions, whether you're talking civil institutions. Let me give you an example here. The public school system. Republicans claim right now that they want the public school system to just be a neutral educational institution, teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, no values. What they're trying to do is eradicate liberal indoctrination, but they're not trying to put in Republican indoctrination. This is stupid. This is something that will never happen. In fact, the education system in our country, the public education system, was intended to indoctrinate students. The reason public schooling became mandatory, the reason our government mandated that children attend public schooling, is because at the time that this became law in the 1850s, there was an influx of immigrants to our country, particularly Catholic immigrants. And the Protestant politicians in charge wanted to indoctrinate the immigrant children in American values so that they would be loyal to America first versus the country of their birth, and in Protestant doctrine because of the centuries-long battle between Protestants and Catholics. So what does this tell us? This tells us that our education system was never supposed to be neutral. The people who brought mandatory public education to our country never thought that the institution would be neutral. They specifically instituted the public school system so that we can indoctrinate children in what is good, and what is right, and what is beautiful in reality. And yet somewhere along the line, Republicans allowed themselves to be convinced that actually the public school system should just be an institution of neutrality. This is incredibly naive. Anybody who has ever watched a child for 6 to 8 hours a day knows that every interaction with that child communicates some kind of values. Obey your teacher? Well, that's a moral value. Don't assault another student? Also a moral value. Do your homework, be respectful of others. All of these are moral values. There's no such thing as a values-neutral education. It is just a question of whether it's going to be Democrat ideologies that are indoctrinated into our students, or Republican values, which would be American values and Judeo-Christian principles. This is the problem with the Republican Party, is they've lost sight of this. They've fallen for these false accusations of the left. The left points at any Republican that wants to acknowledge morality and says, you're violating the separation of church and state. You want a theocracy. Well, let me tell you, the separation of church and state is a phrase mentioned once by Thomas Jefferson in a letter he wrote to the Danbury Baptists, assuring them that government would never infringe upon their free exercise of religion. It doesn't mean that government institutions can't acknowledge moral reality. In fact, our government was intended to acknowledge moral reality. The framing of our Constitution confirms this. When James Madison, the author of our Constitution, says in Federalist Paper 51 that the end of liberty, the definition of liberty is justice, that the goal of every civil society should be justice. The goal of civil society is not the maximum individual freedom for every single individual person. It's a society that allows liberty as a means to virtue. And government institutions and civil institutions play a role in that. But here's the thing. Republicans in elected office, especially in Congress, if I said this to their faces, they'd have no idea what I was talking about. They could never answer the question, well, what is liberty? What's the purpose of governing? What is your purpose as a Republican? What do you hope to achieve collectively? They don't know. They're like, well, limited government, maybe. What does limited government mean? It doesn't mean as small a government as possible. It means limited by enumerated powers and limited by accountability to the people. But government still has just authority to try to achieve something, perhaps human flourishing. But these politicians, they can't define human flourishing because they don't know. They say, well, maybe the free market. We want to lower inflation. Okay, but why? Why do you want to lower inflation? Why do people need to enjoy the free market? What's the purpose of that? It's not to secure maximum individual liberty. It's to secure human flourishing. And until Republicans, especially in elected office, grapple with this question and understand that this is a philosophical deficiency in the Republican Party, then we're going to keep seeing this obnoxious stuff from Republicans in Congress. This is essentially like the election of who's the leadership in a sorority. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. It's embarrassing to the Republican Party. And I would never expect any kind of cohesion from the Republican Party when they have no ideological cohesion. None. We're just going to get this kind of silly, petty, childish nothing. Because the Republican Party has no principles. And I say this, I'm a registered Republican, because the Republican Party is more on my side than the Democrats are. Okay, whatever. They're a useless apparatus. The fact that we are existing in the cultural chaos that we exist in right now is the fault of the Republican Party because they didn't fight back against the left because they were too afraid of imposing morals, too afraid of violating separation of church and state, too afraid of actually acknowledging reality and saying that's wrong, and let me define for you what's right. Until we have a Republican Party that can do that, we're going to have a million of these votes and tons of squishy Republicans all the time, because what does it even mean to be a Republican at this point? If you haven't already gotten my book, that little rant, that's the second half of my book. I go in depth about the problems in the Republican Party. What has gone wrong? Why are we losing and how can we win? What needs to be adjusted? How do we reorient our fighting strategy? And if we reorient the way that I lay out in my book, I promise we'll start winning. So get your copy at hideyourchildrenbook.com or go to Amazon, go to Barnes & Noble, wherever you buy your books. Hide Your Children, Exposing the Marxists Behind the Attack on America's Kids. Thank you for watching today. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.